The morgue was never silent in the way people think. It hummed constantly with the low mechanical rhythm of refrigeration units, the quiet whine of fluorescent lights, and the hollow echo of stainless steel drawers being opened and closed. That night, like so many others, began with the sound of a zipper Emile sliding the cover off a body just brought in from a single-car collision on Autoroute 20. I signed off the intake papers mechanically, eyes barely scanning the forms. 23-year-old female, time of death, 1834, confirmed by paramedics at the scene. Severe head trauma, nothing unusual. Another number on a stretcher. I remember her face more clearly than I should, peaceful in that eerie way that the newly dead often are, lips slightly parted as if in mid-sentence. I made a note of the slight contusion over her eyebrow, a detail not listed in the report, and moved to prep the body for cooling. The drawer labeled R12 was empty, and the internal temperature readout glowed its usual -2 degrees Celsius. I slid her in without resistance. The shift moved forward. Emile and I began the usual cycle of checks, paperwork, tissue inventory. Nothing extraordinary. Until it was time to transfer the next body. That was when the whisper began, not a voice, not words, but a change in the air that made the fluorescence flicker once, almost imperceptibly. I thought I imagined it. At 1:43, I went back to drawer R12. It had been 4 hours, long enough. I was supposed to begin prep for autopsy, and the pathologist would be arriving shortly after sunrise. I remember glancing at the internal thermometer screen again. Still -2 degrees Celsius. Everything as it should be. Then I opened the drawer. The metal rails slid with a familiar metallic sigh, but the cold didn't bite the way it normally did. The air inside was cool, yes, but not cutting. I leaned in and placed the thermometer probe against the corpse's forehead. 19.8 degrees Celsius. I blinked, reset the probe. 19.9 degrees Celsius. I touched her skin. It was soft, supple, not frozen, not rigid with rigor mortis, not drained of warmth the way bodies normally are after so many hours in refrigeration. For a second, I thought the power had gone out. I turned to the wall panel green light, cooling system active. I checked the drawer temperature again, still holding at -2 degrees Celsius. My stomach tightened in a way I hadn't felt since my first week in forensics. I called Emile over. He was tired as always, but when he touched her arm, he stiffened. "She's not cold," he said, pulling his hand away. "She should be cold." We both stood there for a long moment, watching the shallow rise and fall of nothing at all. It was still a body. No breath, no pulse, no response. But somehow it refused to behave like one. "Could be residual warmth," he muttered, though his voice didn't carry conviction. I knew it wasn't. 4 hours in a sealed -2 degrees Celsius environment was enough to chill the marrow. She wasn't warm. She was room temperature. I took the reading again. 20.1 degrees Celsius. I wrote it down in my personal notepad, not the formal log. It was a habit I'd formed after a few too many non-standard events over the years. The kind of things they told us not to worry about. The kind of things that never made it into reports. That's when Emile said something that stuck with me far longer than I wanted it to. "Do you smell that?" I sniffed. Something faint, something sweet like gardenias after rain, mixed with something metallic. Blood has a smell. This wasn't it. I looked at the girl's face again, and for a brief second, I could have sworn the corner of her mouth had curled upward, just a millimeter. Enough to freeze me in place? I blinked hard and looked again. Nothing. Her face was still, serene, lips parted exactly as before. It was probably a trick of the light. It had to be. But Emile had already turned away, muttering that he'd log her for refrigeration failure and put her in drawer R14 instead. I watched him push the stretcher across the tiled floor, the wheels leaving faint streaks of water. R14 was deeper, built for overweight cases. When he opened it, the blast of cold mist reassured me, This was what the morgue was supposed to feel like. She slid in without resistance. He closed the drawer. We didn't speak of it again that night, and I didn't press. But I noted it. Temperature anomaly. Perfume-like scent. Possible facial movement. Entry logged under drawer R14, not R12. The official database would show her in the new location. There would be no reason for anyone to cross-check. But I had made a mark on the bottom edge of her toe tag, a tiny dot with a red Sharpie, right under her date of birth. I needed to know if the body moved again. The rest of the shift passed like a fog. More intakes, more tagging, more silence. We went through the motions. When the pathologist arrived at 7 o'clock, she asked if there were any anomalies. Emile said no. I said nothing. The autopsy for drawer R14 was scheduled for that afternoon. I watched the pathologist input her codes, scan the barcode, and pull the drawer open. The body was cold, completely cold, thermometer reading 2 degrees Celsius. Rigor had fully set in. Muscles stiff, eyes clouded, no scent of gardenias, no trace of warmth. She looked exactly like any other corpse I'd processed in 13 years. I stood there watching as the eye incision began, expecting anything to be wrong. But there wasn't. The body was just a body. I almost convinced myself we had imagined everything, until the incision reached the sternum and the pathologist paused. The blood inside was wrong. Not in color, but in behavior. It hadn't pooled. It wasn't coagulated. It moved, slowly but visibly. There was no heartbeat, no circulation, but the blood within her chest cavity shimmered faintly and pulsed once, just once before, going still. The pathologist looked at me and asked if we had administered any post-mortem anticoagulants. I said no. She stared for another second, shrugged, and continued the procedure. No one else mentioned it again. The official cause of death was recorded as blunt force trauma to the skull and thoracic hemorrhaging consistent with vehicular impact. Time of death, 1834. Autopsy conducted at 15:20 the following day. File closed. Report submitted. Everything by the book, except I knew. And Emile knew. And possibly the pathologist, though she never said another word. What we had seen didn't belong in the reports. What we had smelled, touched, measured, it didn't make sense. But it was real. I wrote it all down in my private notebook that night. I included the precise thermometer readings, the scent description, the toe tag mark, the single red Sharpie dot. I did not tell anyone. I did not mention it in the official logs. And yet, something had begun. I didn't know it then, but that body in drawer R14 wasn't just another corpse. It was the first, the beginning of something that would stretch far beyond that refrigerated room and far beyond anything I'd ever believed possible in a morgue. Because what Emile and I saw that night wasn't death. It was something else. Something pretending to be dead. And for reasons I wouldn't understand until much later, that was only the first time it failed to stay cold. There's a rhythm to morgue work. A grim, methodical cadence that most of us come to rely on more than we realize. The air is always dry. The hum of the cooling system is always present. The dead stay dead. But ever since the girl in drawer R14, that rhythm had begun to falter, like a record with a scratch too faint to call attention to itself, but sharp enough to ruin the music. 3 days after the anomaly, I found myself clocking in early, arriving before Emile, before the shift briefing, before even the janitorial staff had finished their rounds. I stood alone in the corridor leading to the refrigeration chambers, listening to nothing, not just silence absence, as if the building had momentarily forgotten it was supposed to breathe. It started with another body, male, mid-30s, listed as a suspected overdose. No signs of trauma. Time of death, 4:12. He had been discovered slumped against the alley wall behind a pharmacy, needle still embedded in his forearm. The paramedic note was short, clinical, unremarkable. I had no reason to expect anything strange. I slid him into drawer R06. Internal temperature confirmed. -3 degrees Celsius. I didn't notice anything wrong until 2 hours later, during the first status check. RO6 was colder than usual, almost icy, registering at -5 degrees Celsius, and yet the corpse's skin was pliant. The facial muscles still retained tension around the jaw. The pupils had not fully dilated. Most concerning, the abdomen was distended, but without the gaseous odor associated with early decomposition. I made a notation in my private log. When I returned with the thermometer, I paused. There was something else. A sound, not external, but internal, a faint, wet shift within the cavity, like fluid moving under pressure, as if the lungs were adjusting to a breath that would never come. Emil arrived late that day. He looked tired, hollow. I told him about RO6. He nodded without surprise. RO8 did something similar 2 nights ago, he said. Didn't want to tell you. Thought maybe I imagined it. We sat in the staff kitchen for a while, sipping burnt coffee in silence. When I asked what he meant, he just said, movement, just a twitch, maybe a muscle spasm, but the drawer felt ... warm. That word again, warm. It had no place in this building. We spoke no further, but we both knew. The rhythm had cracked. Protocols we had relied on without thinking, the cold, the stiffness, the certainty, were no longer consistent. Later that afternoon, Dr. Hewitt came down earlier than usual. She was often buried in paperwork and rarely joined us in the refrigeration wing until autopsy time. This time she walked straight toward RO6. She hadn't been notified of anything, hadn't read the intake, and yet she went there directly, opened the drawer, stared for a moment, and then closed it again. Log this as delayed autopsy, she told me. Family requested a second opinion. No need to prep. I hesitated. There was no such request in the system. Should I update the record manually? I asked. She gave me a look that cut through my question. No, leave it as is. She left without another word. That evening, Emil and I reviewed the intake logs from the past 2 weeks. Of the 17 bodies stored during that time, 5 had been delayed or rerouted before autopsy. None had been due to family request. 3 had been transferred with no destination listed. When we pulled up the database for one of them, a middle-aged woman listed as expired in transport, her file returned a blank screen. Only her intake number remained, number 4913GX. Her tag was still in the logbook, written in my own hand. But in the hospital system, she had never arrived. I started printing hard copies of every file we processed. I stashed them in a plastic envelope under the 3rd tile behind the supply closet sink, a place no one cleaned, a place even Michelle, the night security guy, rarely passed through. I didn't know what I was preparing for, only that the records we trusted were being altered or erased. Someone, somewhere, didn't want certain patterns visible. That night, Emil suggested we do an informal test. Just humor me, he said, pulling a small Bluetooth thermometer from his coat pocket. We selected a new intake, an elderly man who had passed of natural causes in palliative care. Completely unremarkable. We logged him, tagged him, and placed him in drawer R10. Before closing the drawer, Emil placed the thermometer under his armpit, like they do with live patients. He paired it with his phone and set a timestamp. We sealed the drawer and waited. 2 hours later, the thermometer read 14 degrees Celsius. The drawer itself remained at -3 degrees Celsius. We opened the chamber. The body was warm. Again, Emil whispered, "It's not residual heat. It's not malfunction. Something is off with the bodies themselves." We checked the drawer mechanics, the coolant lines, the digital readouts. Everything was normal. Only the corpses were not. We documented everything, quietly, carefully. I kept my notes in pen, in cursive, on paper that could not be overwritten. We began to compare times, chemical states, muscle elasticity, ocular conditions, and thermographic response. The numbers didn't add up. Some of the bodies showed signs of slow decomposition that defied even the cold temperatures. almost like biological suspension, but without the lab protocols that would make that possible. By the end of the week, the anomalies had reached 7 out of the last 23 corpses. We never spoke of it openly, only in whispers during supply runs or coffee breaks. The security footage sometimes glitched, and we'd find entire sections of time missing, replaced with static frames or looping segments. One night, I saw myself on the monitor, wheeling a body I never touched. The timestamp said 3:17, but I had been home by then. The woman on the screen wore my scrubs, my ID, my walk, but I had no memory of being there. When I showed Emil the footage, he just stared. "They're covering something," he said, "or testing something. Either way, it's happening here." That same night, I returned home and found my bedroom light on. I never leave it on. On my desk was a folded printout. No name, no signature, just a block of text typed in courier font. It read, "Maintain procedural silence. Cross-reference of undocumented anomalies is traceable. All reports must conform to standard parameters. This is your first notice. Nothing else. No watermark. No government seal. Just a reminder that someone was watching." I burned the paper in the sink. By now, I had stopped sleeping through the night. My dreams were filled with bodies twitching under cold sheets, of eyes opening inside sealed drawers, of warmth returning to skin that should never remember heat. Something had begun, and whatever it was, it had crept in under the guise of the normal, through routine, through repetition, through silence. And the worst part was knowing that none of it would ever appear in a report. We were already deep in the pattern by then, and yet nothing prepared us for Drawer 9. The previous anomalies, however disturbing, had followed a certain twisted logic: residual warmth, broken records, flickering systems, minor physical inconsistencies that could, if one squinted hard enough, be explained by technical failure, human error, or grief-induced imagination. But the woman in Drawer 9 didn't allow for any such comfort. She didn't fit in any sense of the word. Her name was listed as Anouk Gerard, 52 years old, cause of death, myocardial infarction. She had collapsed during a conference at the Palais des Congrès, revived once by paramedics, then flatlined en route to Hôpital Notre Dame. Declared dead at 11:12 a.m. By 17 o'clock, she was with us. Standard intake. External condition, unremarkable. I tagged her myself, verified vitals none, confirmed brain death, signed the digital chain of custody, and wheeled her into Chamber B for temporary refrigeration. Emil and I moved with the reflexes of routine, speaking little. When we reached the drawer, something felt immediately wrong. The rails groaned. The chamber seemed narrower. I remember Emil chuckling softly and muttering, "Looks like she's a tight fit." We angled the stretcher, adjusted the limbs, applied gentle pressure at the shoulders, and still the body resisted entry, not violently, not through rigidity. It was as though the drawer itself refused to accept her. I checked the specs. Our 09 was rated for up to 120 kilograms. She was maybe 65, 70 at most. There was no reason she shouldn't fit. But the moment her legs crossed the threshold, the air changed denser, humid, as if the steel and freon had somehow remembered warmth. We pushed a second time. The drawer accepted her halfway, then jammed. I pulled her out. We tried again. This time, we got her in, closed the chamber, logged the entry. 2 hours later, the chamber beeped. A low, steady tone. Drawer error. Drawer R09. Cooling issue. I reopened it. Anouk lay exactly as we had left her, or so I thought. But her left arm now rested across her chest, something I knew for a fact had not been the case. I always position bodies the same way. Arms at the sides, fingers curled slightly inward, face forward. Her hand now pressed delicately above her sternum, not crossed, not clutching, just placed as if in contemplation. I called Emil. He didn't answer. I checked the logs. No one else had accessed the drawer. I leaned in. The drawer temperature had risen to 5 degrees Celsius. I rechecked the exterior thermostat. -2 degrees Celsius. I touched her wrist. The skin was cold, but not more cold, and her nails had been clean trimmed at intake. Now there was something under them, a dark smear. I scraped it with a swab and sealed it, not even knowing why. Later, I'd send it to a friend in pathology who owed me a favor. The sample would come back as organic sediment with plant matter unidentified. But that night, I simply closed the drawer and stepped back. At 3:12, the cameras in Chamber B went offline. Not a glitch offline. We had just had them serviced the week prior. I went in with my flashlight. R09 was slightly ajar. No one else was in the room. I stood in the doorway, the beam of light trembling slightly as it landed on the steel edge of the drawer. It wasn't open enough to see inside, just a sliver, a black line of absence. I approached, heartbeat loud in my ears, and nudged the drawer closed. It slid easily, too easily, as if it had been waiting. I sealed it with a secondary tag and red tape per malfunction protocol. I printed a private label, unauthorized access, an old habit we used during lockdown drills. I logged the temperature spike in my personal notes and left the official entry untouched. When Emil arrived the next morning, he looked worse than usual. Pale, bags under his eyes, fingers trembling. He didn't greet me, just stood by the sink, staring at his reflection in the steel cabinets. "She was moving," he said. "I saw it." I asked what he meant. "Drawer 9. Just now." Her foot tapped against the side, like she was shifting position. I didn't speak. I couldn't. It felt like our roles had reversed. He now carried the fear, the disbelief. I was simply hollow. We agreed to move her. No clearance, no permission. We wheeled her back out and placed her in R16, deeper, isolated. That's when we saw the bruise. A fresh one, spreading slowly under the clavicle. It hadn't been there at intake. No possible way. Purple, almost green at the edges. Consistent with impact, as if someone or something had struck her hard while inside a locked drawer. Emil whispered, "They bruise after death, but not like this. Not that fresh." I nodded, taking photos with my personal phone, not the hospital device. I saved them to an encrypted drive. When Dr. Hewitt asked where the body from R09 had gone, I lied, said she'd been transferred for release to the family. She didn't press, just nodded once and walked away. That was the moment I realized she knew more than we did, possibly much more. Later that week, I caught her standing alone outside the cold chamber, looking at the digital display of drawer numbers. Her fingers moved slowly across the panel, hovering over R09. She didn't open it, just watched. Then she turned and walked away. I asked Michel, our security guard, if the system had recorded any unusual movement. He hesitated, then handed me a flash drive. "You didn't get this from me." The footage showed Chamber B at 3:12. The moment the cameras went offline, there was a single frame of distortion, not a glitch, an overlay, a reflection that didn't belong. In that frame, for just a millisecond, you could see the outline of a hand pressed against the inside of the steel drawer from within. Splayed fingers, tension, detail so clear you could count the knuckles. I printed it, stored it, encrypted it 3 times. That image burned into my brain like a brand. It was the first physical evidence that something was inside those drawers that did not belong in any morgue, anywhere. Not just a failure of death, but a resistance to it. A push from beneath the sheet, from inside the cold. From then on, I passed drawer 9 with a kind of reverence. I never used it again. I logged it as cooling unit defective and had the maintenance team flag it for future inspection. They never came. The request was archived, forgotten, but I didn't forget. Neither did Emil, and neither did she. The institution, like most, survives on paper. The documents are precise, clinical, cold. They don't shiver when you sign them, and they don't remember the way your hands shook while doing so. But every nurse, every technician, every cleaner in our wing knew none of us were living the same morgue that was described in the official reports. And the more the files piled up, the more the silence around them became a kind of violence. Because something was moving beneath the surface, beneath the steel, beneath the protocols. And someone, somewhere, wanted it kept exactly there beneath. I kept a copy of every anomalous entry in a locked drawer in my flat. Drawer, not digital. Never digital. What would I even write in the database? Body temperature increased 4 degrees Celsius post-mortem. Retracted eyes opened upon exposure to light. Evidence of bruising after refrigeration. No one would read it. Or worse, someone would. Someone with clearance levels above ours. Someone like the man who started appearing in the hallways late at night. I first saw him in the reflection of the sterilization glass tall. Charcoal suit, no visible ID, walking with a pace that didn't match the tired shuffle of the rest of us. I turned. He was gone. I saw him again 3 days later, this time speaking with Dr. Hewitt in the corridor near the staff lounge. She didn't see me watching from the stairwell, but her posture gave her away. She never stood with her hands clasped like that, not even during autopsy briefings. It was the posture of someone cornered. Later that week, we received a notice. All incident reports were to be submitted via a new internal portal. Password protected, encrypted, supposedly more efficient. It was the same week Drawer 9 disappeared from the active drawer list on our system. Not disabled, erased, re-indexed as ROO. And all footage related to it? Corrupted. Michel, our security officer, just shook his head and muttered something about blank frames and noise. Even he didn't want to dig too deep. Still, we tried to speak up. I filed a flagged report after an event with another body. A man listed as unknown, late 50s, found floating in the canal. No ID, no next of kin. His corpse arrived swollen, distorted from water, bloated beyond recognition. But after 3 days in refrigeration, he had deflated, unnaturally so. His skin regained tone. His jaw, which had been dislocated, now aligned neatly. On the 4th day, his left eye opened. Just one, and stayed that way. I stared into it for longer than I should have, and I swear I saw focus. Not just light response, focus. That eye knew it was being watched. When I added the event to his file, I got an automated rejection. Incompatible data format. I tried rephrasing it, removing emotional qualifiers, reducing it to numbers. Still rejected. I sent a direct email to Hewitt. No response. The next day, the body was gone. Record listed him as released to Research Division, internal transfer. No such division exists in our hospital. That's when Emil suggested we start writing everything by hand. Real logs, unofficial, hidden. We used a spare nurse's notebook, dated every entry, cross-referenced each incident. Drawer numbers, names, anomalies, temperatures, times, night sounds, malfunctions, people who disappeared. We never spoke of the book aloud. We called it Le Carnet des Morts, the death ledger. But there were others who had noticed. Sandrine, the youngest among us, came to me one morning trembling. She'd been told to clean out room C for a special procedure. She wasn't given details, only gloves and a cart. When she entered, she found 2 orderlies she didn't recognize wheeling out a body wrapped not in the standard cloth, but in a dark plastic material she'd never seen before. They looked at me like I wasn't supposed to be there, she said. Not angry, not surprised, just disappointed, as if her presence had broken some unspoken rule. She asked Hewitt about it the next day. She didn't come back to work after that week. Sick leave, they said, then resignation. No one followed up. The reports kept changing. I'd check files and find that timestamps had been altered, toe tags corrected, entries rewritten. One of our patients, who had died from complications related to ALS, was listed 3 days later as deceased due to trauma-related accident. When I pointed it out to the administration, they nodded and said, "Thank you, we'll look into it." Nothing happened. That was the real morgue. Not the bodies, not the drawers, but the erasure of truth. And slowly, all of us began to doubt the reality around us. If records could be rewritten, if cameras edited themselves, if drawers changed numbers, then who were we to argue? The worst moment came when I found an entry in my own handwriting, an event I had no memory of. It detailed a body I never received, with notes in my usual style, my phrasing, even my shorthand. But I know I didn't write it. It was dated on a night I was home, sick, watching reruns and nursing a fever. I cross-checked the hospital logs. According to the system, I had signed in at 22:47. I called IT. No anomalies, they said. Badge access confirmed. But I still have the badge in my drawer at home. I never left the house. That's when I began locking everything. Not just the death ledger, but my own notebooks, personal files, even the scrub locker. Emil went one step further. He stopped sleeping at home. Said it didn't feel safe anymore. One night he called me, whispering, panicked. Said he'd found red fibers in his sink, like the ones we use on cadaver straps. No one had visited him. He lived alone. I told him to come over. He never arrived. The next morning, he was back at work, pale, exhausted, jittery. I asked if he was okay. He looked at me, confused, said he'd been home all night, asleep, sighed he hadn't called me. I showed him the call log. He stared at the number, then at me, and quietly said, "That's not my phone." The reports, the truth, our memories, they were all starting to bleed together. Nothing stayed fixed. Nothing could be trusted, not even our own minds. And that was the point. Because when you no longer know what is real, you stop asking the wrong questions. There's an old saying in our line of work that no one ever really gets used to it. You just stop reacting. The silence of the morgue isn't peaceful. It's oppressive. It presses against your skull like pressure underwater. And sometimes, the only thing that keeps you tethered is the mechanical whir of the refrigeration unit, steady, constant, unchanging. But the night the hum stopped and no one noticed, everything else started to unravel. It began with drawer 12. That drawer had a reputation even before the incident, though no one ever said it aloud. Bodies assigned to it often came back with inconsistencies, shifted limbs, changed facial expressions, missing tags, recordings that didn't match. At first, it felt like human error. After all, we were short-staffed, exhausted, overworked. We made mistakes. But when a third-year medical student pointed out that the thermograph record for drawer 12 hadn't logged any refrigeration cycles in over 72 hours, everything snapped into focus. That drawer hadn't been plugged in, not for 3 days. And the body, an elderly woman who had passed away due to cardiac arrest, had not shown a single sign of decomposition. No odor, no marbling, no bloating. Her skin was still taut. Her hair still smelled faintly of lavender shampoo. She looked better than when we'd received her. Dr. Hewitt said it was a sensor issue. Michelle said it was a system update glitch. Maintenance ran checks, claimed the drawer was operational. But when Emil and I opened the panel behind it during night shift, we found the plug wrapped in tape, looped neatly, not even close to the socket. It hadn't been connected in months. The dust told the truth. I took photos, printed them. I wasn't stupid enough to keep them digitally. That same night, I slid them into the death ledger. The next day, when I returned to the locker, the envelope was still there, but the photos were blank. The film hadn't been destroyed. It had been wiped. No damage, no signs of tampering. Just empty white rectangles where the drawer should have been. Then came the smell. Not rot, not human decay, something older. Wet metal, burnt sugar, plastic left too long under heat. The kind of smell that settles behind your eyes and lingers in your throat for days. It began drifting from drawer 12 during night shifts, never during the day. Day crews logged normal readings. We logged abnormal silences, empty data fields, and unexplained crashes in the monitoring software. I asked Sandrine before she vanished if she ever felt watched in that hallway. She laughed at first. then whispered that sometimes she heard breathing when she passed that fridge. Heavy. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Like someone asleep or pretending to be. She stopped laughing after that and requested rotation. Her request was denied. 3 days later, she quit without turning in her badge. HR said she'd accepted a job abroad. No one got to say goodbye. One night, I stayed past my shift, told Hewitt I had paperwork. The truth is, I waited for the place to clear out. I wanted to test it myself. I rolled drawer 12 out. The woman's body was gone. In her place, an empty stretcher, but not quite empty. Strapped to the inside were leather cuffs. Not ours. Older, rusted, dried stains I didn't want to analyze. And underneath, carved directly into the metal, a series of scratches letters, maybe numbers, maybe not. Jagged, inconsistent, like someone had scratched at it repeatedly over time, not to form words, but to leave something behind. A trace, a scream that didn't echo. When I reported the missing body the next morning, the system still listed her as in storage. I ran the barcode again. It beeped. Green light. Present. Occupied. Location. Drawer 12. But it was empty. And still unplugged. That's when the dreams started. Not nightmares, exactly. More like echoes. I'd fall asleep and wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I'd just been in the drawer myself. Cramped, cold but not cold, unable to move. Sometimes I'd see her face in the dream, not bloated, not dead, but awake, eyes open, mouth moving in reverse, like speech played backward. Sometimes I woke up to the sound of the drawer sliding open in my mind, metal scraping against metal in an endless loop. I tried not to talk about it, but one night, during rotation, Emil looked at me across the hallway and asked, "Did she speak to you too?" He hadn't even said her name, but we both knew. I asked Hewitt again, what happened to the body? Was it relocated? Lost? She stared at me and smiled with her lips, not her eyes. "We're a hospital," she said. "We don't lose things." Then she turned and walked into her office, door clicking shut like a trap snapping closed. A week later, the drawer disappeared. Not just the body, the entire unit gone, covered with a temporary maintenance sheet. When I pulled it back, there was nothing behind it, not even the wall. Just a panel of fresh paint and drywall. No seam, no mount, like the drawer had never been there. I asked Michel from security for the footage. He shrugged. That hallway's under blackout. Maintenance rerouted all cameras for an upgrade. Convenient. Too convenient. That's when I realized it wasn't just about the drawer. It was about the space it occupied. Something had nested there. Something that fed on silence, on institutional blindness. Something that didn't need to breathe because it breathed through us. Through the reports we didn't file. Through the questions we didn't ask. And if the hospital could pretend it never existed, then maybe it never had. Maybe we were the only proof that it had ever been real, which meant we were next. There are certain things you expect to be constant in a morgue, and airflow is one of them. Cold always falls, warm always rises, and the refrigeration units hum like distant engines on a ship you'll never leave. It's one of those silent assurances if the cold is stable, then the dead stay still. But that night, the cold came from the wrong direction. It didn't settle from the vents above. It rose from the floor, from the drains, from the walls, from inside things. It was just past 2 a.m. when I felt it first standing in the autopsy suite alone, reviewing the report from the missing body. The room grew colder in a way that felt unnatural, like stepping into a meat locker that hadn't been cleaned in years. But the thermostat read 18 degrees Celsius. Nothing had changed. Nothing should have changed. Then the table began to sweat. Not me. Not the windows. The table. Stainless steel doesn't sweat. Not unless something's very wrong. I ran my hand across the surface dry at first. Then, as I lifted my palm, beads formed as if reacting to a sudden and aggressive drop in temperature. I looked up at the vent overhead still. No airflow. No hum. The units weren't working. Yet the room was growing colder by the second. I turned to leave, but the hallway was darker than it should have been. Emergency lights glowed dim red, like the inside of a submarine during lockdown. I hadn't noticed them before. I checked the control panel near the door. No errors logged, no power fluctuations. Still, the chill was climbing, and I realized something I hadn't noticed. There was no sound. No humming from the vents. No distant squeaks from the old elevator. Not even the soft ticking of the wall clock. Just that alive silence, thick, breathing, aware. When I stepped into the corridor, my foot hit a puddle. Not water condensation, like the kind that forms inside sealed packages in freezers. The tiles were fogged with moisture, despite the air being impossibly dry. I followed the trail. It led to the main refrigeration bay. That was when I saw the door open. Not unlocked, wide open. And the cold? It wasn't spilling out of the room. It was pulling inward, like a reverse vacuum. The plastic strips that hang over the entrance to preserve temperature were sucked inward toward the darkness, fluttering like desperate fingers clawing at something unseen. I called out for Emil. No answer. I approached the doorway, hesitant. The lights were flickering inside, not failing, pulsing, in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like breathing. I took one step in, then another. The air turned sharper, cutting into my lungs with a taste like pennies and bleach. Every hair on my arms stood on end. Inside, the drawers were vibrating. Not violently, subtly, like engines purring low under the skin of the room. I checked the panels. No temperature readings. Just blank screens, static, dead pixels. And then came the sound faint at first. A whisper, but not from a human mouth. It came from inside the walls. Not behind. Inside, the voice wasn't speaking words. It was rhythm. Something like breath, but distorted. A mockery of breathing. 1, 2, long pause. 1, 2, metallic. Hollow, echoing. The way a voice might sound if it were trying to mimic life after never having known it. I backed away and slammed the door shut. The moment it clicked, the plastic strips stopped fluttering. The pressure reversed. The room behind me was dead again. But I wasn't. I was shivering, heart hammering, mouth dry. I ran to the console to log the anomaly, but the system had rebooted. And when it came back, there was no record of the door being opened. No dips in temperature. No environmental warnings. Nothing. I messaged Dr. Hewitt. No reply. I tried calling Michelle. Straight to voicemail. Then I received a text. Do not file. You were never there. No ID. Just those words. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the break room. Lights on, eyes open, unable to sleep. Every few minutes, I thought I heard the door creak open again. I'd rush out, check the hallway. Nothing. But once, around 4:15 a.m., I swear I saw someone down at the end of the corridor. Not walking, not standing, floating, a blur between the cold and the dark. Dressed in a morgue gown, barefoot and pale, but not bloated, not decomposed, just wrong. Like a wax figure sculpted from memory, not observation. When I blinked, it was gone. The next day, I confronted Hewitt in her office. She didn't let me speak. She handed me an envelope, sealed, thick, heavy. Inside, a non-disclosure agreement, a transfer request form, a severance package, and a photo of me, standing in front of the open refrigeration unit, looking directly at the camera. The problem? That photo couldn't have existed. There were no cameras in that room, and I had never taken a step inside. The paper was thick, almost waxy, like it had been laminated in silence. I didn't sign the NDA, not yet, but I kept the photo, slipped it inside my locker behind an old shift schedule, and locked the door twice. I told myself I'd forget it, let it fade with the smell of formalin and bleach that clung to my skin. But something changes in you when you see evidence of a thing that never happened, a ghost caught in the act of being real. And in the morgue, where truth is stored in drawers and silence is policy, nothing is more dangerous than something real that isn't supposed to exist. I went back to work like nothing happened. That's how it works there. You carry the strangeness in your chest like a mass, hoping it doesn't grow into something noticeable. My shifts were quieter after that. No more odd noises. No more wrong airflow. But people around me had changed. I noticed the way Emile avoided the refrigeration bay, how Lucy started double-checking locked doors she used to ignore, and how Dr. Hewitt, for the first time since I'd known her, kept her office door closed. It was Lucy who broke the unspoken silence first. We were doing a standard prep on a cardiac case. No foul play, middle-aged man. The kind of case you could sleepwalk through. But when she pulled back the sheet, she froze. Her hands trembled. I followed her gaze. There, just below the sternum, were rows of sutures. Dozens of them. Sloppy, like they'd been reopened and stitched over and over again. The file had no mention of previous surgeries. But what made it worse wasn't the stitching. It was what was under his fingernail scrapes of pale blue rubber, like surgical glove material. Lucy stepped back, looked at me, and said quietly, "They're coming undone." That night, she didn't clock out. Her badge was found outside near the dumpsters. Security said she left early. No one questioned it. No one called. Her locker was emptied by morning. The next day, we were all summoned to a mandatory meeting. No reason. No agenda. Just a plain email from admin, no signature. The conference room was too small for the entire night crew, but we crammed in. Nurses and techs and orderlies, who had worked side by side for years, suddenly unable to look each other in the eye. Dr. Hewitt walked in 5 minutes late, eyes red, hair pulled back tight, wearing a sweater I'd never seen her wear before. She didn't greet us. She just stood, closed the door, and locked it. What followed wasn't a meeting. It was something else. A script. A ritual. She spoke calmly, like reciting a disclaimer. "You may have observed anomalies," she began. "Temperature irregularities, equipment malfunctions, bodies logged but not found, or found but never logged. These are not malfunctions. These are not accidents. These are to be noted and ignored. If approached for comment, you have not seen anything. If asked to testify, you do not recall. If presented with evidence, you do not recognize it. This meeting did not happen. This conversation is not occurring." There was a silence that settled over the room. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Every single person there had seen something, and every single one had chosen not to speak of it. Until now. But we weren't speaking. We were being instructed how to continue not speaking. Then she said something that burned itself into my skull. "They're not ours," she didn't explain. She didn't need to. She handed out sealed folders. No names, just numbers. Mine was 0387. Inside, a one-page memo titled Incident Protocol Delta V. It listed a sequence of procedures in case of animated anomalies. That was the word used. Animated, not reanimated, not alive, just mobilized without external cause. The memo included containment instructions, temperature thresholds, and a single handwritten note. "Do not open any drawer without confirmation of stillness. Stillness is the only proof." I asked a question. I don't even remember what. Maybe I asked about Lucy. Maybe I asked what stillness meant. But Dr. Hewitt interrupted me before I finished. "You're already too close." Then she opened the door and dismissed us one by one. That night, Emile came to me during break. We sat in the service corridor near the service elevators, the hum of machinery above us masking our words. He told me he'd worked there 15 years. He said this wasn't the first meeting. They happen every 6 or 7 years, always after a cluster. That's what they call it when too many things happen too close together, missing bodies, altered reports, shifts in cold airflow, and always someone disappears. Sometimes staff, sometimes patients, sometimes things we don't talk about. He said there were rumors that the hospital was built over something older, that the basement where the refrigeration units were now used to be a part of a sanatorium, that patients weren't always buried, that some were kept, that some never really died. I asked why no one left. He laughed, not cruelly, just tired. Where would we go? What would we say? Who would believe us? I wanted to tell him I would leave, that I would go public, that I would record the next incident. But deep down I knew the truth. I wouldn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I was curious. Because whatever was behind the stitched chests and the cold air and the whispered protocols, it was real. And once you glimpse the real, the ordinary dies inside you. I didn't sleep that week. I took extra shifts, volunteered for night duty, stared at the drawer, marked 44B longer than I should have. And then, one night, it opened on its own. It was during that hour of suspension that drapes itself over hospital corridors like a damp, woolen cloth between 2:45 and 3:30 a.m., when the walls begin to exhale differently, and even the most rational among us begins to feel the edges of something watching. That night, I was alone, or rather scheduled to be alone, since Emil had left mid-shift, claiming a migraine with no warning. A rare thing for him, someone who once worked 12-hour doubles without flinching. But that week had shifted something in all of us. The meeting we were not allowed to remember echoed anyway, not in words, but in behaviors. People took longer routes through hallways, left earlier, closed doors behind them they once left open. And now I was there, seated in the prep room with only the hum of freezers and the soft tick of the embalming pump to remind me that time was still moving forward, even when everything inside me screamed that it wasn't. The incident began, not with a scream, but with the absence of a sound. I'd learned to depend on the whir of the cold storage fans. I looked up from the logbook, pen paused mid-checkmark, as the silence spread outward like an oil slick. I could hear my own breath too clearly. I stood, walked toward the refrigeration bay, and as I reached the threshold, the automatic lights flickered, not off, just enough to change color, as though someone had inserted a filter of bone over everything. The temperature on the central panel read -1 degrees Celsius, which was wrong. We never let it rise above -4. I tapped the touchscreen to refresh. No response. Then the alert began. Drawer 44B, unsealed. Status, unstable. I should have followed protocol. Called maintenance. Logged the incident. Waited for day shift. But I didn't. Curiosity, maybe. Or the deep, humming urge that had grown in me ever since I saw that photograph of the corpse with its eyes sewn from the inside. A thing that looks back through the stitch. I walked in. The lights inside the unit were soft, blue-tinted, cold. There were 20 drawers on each wall, rows of sterile rectangles, each hiding a silence of its own. And one, slightly ajar 44B, its locking indicator blinking amber, casting a weak pulse across the tiled floor like a dying heartbeat. I approached slowly. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Not even the usual hum. A stillness so total, it felt like I'd been suspended in someone else's breath. I placed my gloved hand on the edge of the drawer and pulled it open the rest of the way. Empty, no body, no sheet, nothing. Just the rectangular indentation where a weight should have been. But the metal was wet, and in the condensation, just above where the neck would have rested, were 5 small prints, like fingers, pressed outward against the steel, smudged slightly as though they'd been removed mid-struggle. I backed away. That's when I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. Not a whisper, not a growl, something between. A vibration made of breath and regret and wet cloth. It came from behind the drawers. Not inside them. Behind. A crawl space no one ever mentioned. A panel no one acknowledged. My knees felt weak, but I moved anyway. Not out of bravery, but out of that same pull you feel standing at the edge of a tall building. The panel was loose. The screws stripped long ago. I pulled it away and saw the tunnel narrow, barely wide enough for a body to slide through. And inside it, a nurse's uniform. Torn, bloody, pale blue. The old style, phased out 5 years ago. The name tag was half melted, but I saw enough. C. Lalonde. Claudine Lalonde. A nurse I'd heard about only in whispers. One of the retired early cases supposedly had a breakdown, vanished before her pension hearing. Some said she'd fled, some said she'd taken pills. But seeing her uniform there, stuffed like an offering into the hollow behind the drawer, I knew she hadn't left. She'd been taken. I turned to run, but the lights cut entirely. No buzz, no pop, just gone. I stood in the dark, eyes adjusting, breath held like a prayer. Then something brushed past me. Cold, fast, wet, not touching skin exactly, but the air around it, displacing the heat, dragging the scent of formaldehyde and something sour like wilted flowers left too long in water. I didn't scream. I walked backward until I hit the threshold, pushed through the door, and slammed it behind me. Locked it. Double locked. Triple. I left the lights off and sat against the wall, trembling. At 4:12 a.m., the lights came back. At 4:19, Dr. Hewitt entered alone with a clipboard. She didn't look at once. She found me in the hall, eyes swollen, uniform damp with sweat. She said nothing, just held out her hand. I gave her the badge, the key card, the photo I'd taken of the drawer. She nodded, turned, and walked into the refrigeration bay. The lock engaged behind her with a sound that was almost ritualistic, like closing a vault or a tomb. I didn't go home that morning. I went to the nurse's archives. We keep records. We pretend we don't, but we do. Paper logs, analog files tucked behind falsified audits. I looked up C. Lalonde. No resignation, no pension, no complaint, just a short notation in red. Transferred. Internal use only. That phrase again. I checked other names, more than I expected. Some I remembered, some I didn't. All with the same note. All nurses. And each had logged their final shift within 30 days of a drawer malfunction. They weren't retired. They weren't fired. They had stayed too long, and I was beginning to realize. So had I. It happened 4 nights after the incident with drawer 44B. I hadn't slept properly since. My mind felt like a soaked bandage, weighted, slow, and wrapped around something festering that I couldn't see but felt pulsing just beneath the surface. I hadn't spoken to anyone about what I'd seen, not even Emil, who'd returned to work 2 days later, acting as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. But I noticed how he no longer entered the refrigeration wing alone, how he flinched at certain drawer numbers and kept the overhead light dimmer than usual. We were all unraveling, slowly, like old stitching under pressure. No one said it out loud, but the morgue had changed. The walls breathed differently. The tiles remembered footsteps. And some drawers, once closed, no longer stayed that way. That night, I was on my 3rd cup of vending machine coffee when the alert came in simple routine. An unidentified male, early 40s, cause of death pending, found near the tracks at milepost 31. Nothing unusual, but something about the timestamp bothered me. The body had been logged at 2:06 a.m., but no one had brought anything in. I would have heard it. The loading bay door hadn't opened. I checked the surveillance feed minutes of black screen and static, distortion from 158 to 213. I stared at the flickering square of absence on the monitor and told myself it was just a glitch. I repeated that like a charm as I walked toward the intake room. The body was already there, covered neatly, tagged, drawer 19A. Whoever had done the intake had followed procedure down to the finest detail, except they hadn't initialed the form. No nurse, no doctor, no mortician had signed the arrival. It simply appeared. I hovered beside the drawer for a long time, staring at the crisp white sheet pulled taut over the shape of a man. Something in my stomach clenched. I reached out, more to prove myself wrong than out of any sense of duty, and peeled back the sheet. The man's face was familiar. In that uncanny, electric way something from a dream sometimes is. Pale, of course, bruised around the lips. The left side of his head partially crushed. But it wasn't the injury that held me in place. It was the expression, the faintest trace of a smirk. And the eyes, open. Clouded, yes, but open. Staring. not glazed in the usual lifeless way, but directed. At me. I stepped back instinctively, heart thudding. That was when I saw the tag looped around his wrist. I picked it up slowly, read the scrawled handwriting beneath the standard barcode, and dropped it. My name, full, first, middle, last. For Nurse M. Charon, he's yours. No date, no cause of death, just that message. I backed away so quickly, I nearly knocked over the instrument tray. My breath caught in my throat like a stone. I wanted to believe it was a joke. A cruel one, maybe, but explainable. Yet no one I knew had handwriting like that. It was too precise. Curved in the same way the autopsy labels from the 1970s used to be. I ran to the archives, checked drawer 19A's history. The system showed it hadn't been used in over 12 years. The last registered body, a patient named Andre Charon, my uncle, a schizophrenic who'd vanished in 1989 and was declared legally dead in 2001. I had no memory of ever seeing his corpse. I opened that file. His medical records were incomplete. Most of the documents had been redacted or replaced with the internal use-only stamp. But tucked in the corner of the folder was a photograph, a black and white headshot from the old psychiatric hospital ID program. The face was unmistakable, the same one lying in drawer 19A, untouched, unaged, just as I remembered him from the one photo my mother never let me keep. But the strangest thing was his cause of death, finally listed in the oldest document in the back, presumed suicide. Milepost 31, the same place this new body had supposedly been found. I froze. I checked the body's dental records. There were none. The fingerprints were smudged. The coroner hadn't signed anything, and yet everything felt official, neat, almost ceremonial. I returned to the drawer. The sheet was back over the face. I hadn't replaced it, and now there was something else, taped to the inside of the drawer door. A note, written in the same hand. He asked to see you. You were the last name, he said. That was when the overhead lights flickered, not failed, just dimmed in that now familiar way, washing the room in a sick yellow pallor. I turned slowly and saw Emil in the doorway, but his expression was blank, his face pale, as if he were seeing something else. Not me, not the room. He whispered something I didn't understand and backed away without another word. That was when the body moved. Not violently, not theatrically, just one twitch. The left hand curled slightly, as if in recognition. I closed the drawer immediately, locked it, and backed out of the room. The next morning, when I returned to update the files, drawer 19A was empty again. No intake record, no forensic follow-up, nothing in the log. And yet the tag with my name on it was pinned to the bulletin board in the staff lounge, underneath a schedule I knew I hadn't signed up for. Night shift, 3 weeks. Solo coverage. They wanted me to stay. They'd chosen me. Or maybe he had. And I had already begun to forget what my own handwriting looked like. I stayed. I don't remember when exactly the decision became irreversible, whether it was in the silence between drawers or during the hours. I spent staring at forms that no longer matched the bodies they were supposed to catalog. At some point, the clock in the break room stopped resetting. The walls forgot their paint color, and the door to the lower refrigeration corridor stopped responding to my key card, yet it always opened when I approached. I never questioned why. I no longer wrote reports. My hands moved over paper, but the words no longer made sense. Time thinned around me, not in ways I could measure, but in ways I could feel visceral, softening, like wet cloth laid over mirrors. By then, I understood we were past bureaucracy, past procedures. There were things in this morgue older than the foundation, older than the hospital itself. Things that had been waiting, not in malice, but in patience, watching how we filed names, how we believed that cataloging the dead gave us power over them. But we were wrong. The drawers do not obey paperwork. The cold does not preserve the soul. It only slows the memory of screaming. And once you begin to hear the echoes, once the drawer you open whispers back a name you haven't spoken since childhood, it's already too late. The night everything slipped fully into what I now accept as permanence began like any other. The hum of the lights, the stench of ethanol and latex. I was alone. Or perhaps I never had been. The schedule, still pinned to the wall with my name stretched across the remaining weeks like a commandment, hadn't changed. But I'd stopped clocking in. The time cards had dissolved in water one night, or maybe I had dreamed that. I didn't sleep anymore. Not in the usual way. The body adjusts when it forgets how to rest. You begin to function in half-light, in the rhythms of decay and refrigeration. I could tell the day of the week by the texture of the cadavers. Mondays were stiff, Thursdays were soft, Saturdays never came. That night, a new body was brought in. At least, that's what I told myself. I didn't see who delivered it. I didn't sign anything. But drawer 22C, long broken and sealed with tape for nearly 5 years, was suddenly open. Not ajar wide open, waiting. Inside was no body, only a chair. A simple folding chair, rusted at the edges, and a file folder, my name typed neatly on the tab. I lifted it slowly. Inside were pages, dozens of them, all filled with my handwriting. Reports I had never written, detailing deaths I had never witnessed, dates I hadn't lived through. Each one signed at the bottom, not by me, but by someone who wore my name. And above the last page, a photograph, a recent one, of me, standing in the intake room. But there was something off. My eyes were shut. My arms were crossed over my chest, and a toe tag looped around my ankle. There was no blood, no wound, just stillness. A silence beneath silence. I dropped the folder. It made no sound. I turned to run, but I didn't move. My legs refused. Not out of fear, but something deeper. Acceptance. As if I had always known that drawer 22C would eventually call for me. That was when the voices started. Not loud, not even whispers. They were the sounds between thoughts, breaths between exhales. My uncle, the man from drawer 44B, the girl with the sewn eyelids, the nurse who vanished in 1997, whose badge still unlocks the elevator to the sub-basement. They were all there, not accusing, not beckoning, just recognizing me as one of their own. I stepped into the drawer. It was larger than it should have been. My shoulders didn't brush the metal sides. The chair was warm. The air smelled of old paperwork and hospital soap. I sat. The drawer didn't close, not physically, but everything else did. The morgue around me, the corridor, the hum, the clocks, the weight of the living world. They all recessed like the tide pulling away from a shoreline no one would ever visit again. I don't know how long I remained. When I opened my eyes, I was in the staff lounge. Daylight. A nurse I didn't recognize walked past me without a word. The calendar on the wall said 2009, but it was pristine. Not yellowed, not worn. My coffee cup was full, still warm. The surveillance feed on the monitor showed me, seated at the intake desk, filling out a report I had no memory of writing. When I blinked, the person on the screen blinked too, but not at the same time. They've built something here, or maybe uncovered something. A network of memory, flesh and cold. The morgue is not a place, it's a cycle. An archive of those who tried to map death and forgot that death also learns, also watches, also waits. You begin as a recorder, then as a witness, then as evidence, and finally as report. I tried to file my final entry, but the system rejected my credentials, said I no longer existed. So I returned to drawer 22C. The chair is still there. The folder now has a new tab. Next. And if you're reading this, if somehow these words survive the draw of forgetting, then you're already too close. The lights will flicker. The door will open when it shouldn't. And one of the drawers will whisper your name, not like a threat, but like a reminder. Because some stories were never meant to be written. But once you've heard them, you belong to them.